Hello everybody, and welcome to Some Patches Required, a show where we hope to educate and entertain you on the ever-turbulent games industry. As always, I am one of your hosts, Aaron.
And I'm your otherist host, Zak.
You know what I like otherists.
Yeah, I
Otherist
thought of that
is pretty
literally
good.
in the last 10 seconds.
That's inspiration strikes. So before we do, as we always do, and get into the episode, I would first like to, of course, thank all of our returning listeners. If you've stuck it out with us up to this point, thank you very, very much. And if you are hopping on for the first time, much appreciated. Welcome to the show. Happy to have you here. If you would all kind of collectively not mind too terribly hitting the old engagement button, or rather sharing the show with a friend, or as we often like to encourage you to do, a mortal enemy, that would be much appreciated. It is our best and really only way of growing as a show. And we really appreciate any help that you can give us in that domain. And then we arrived at the topic. Normally when we sit down to try and find conversations to have, we try not to double dip on general topic ideas or, stuff that has too much crossover. But we are once again returning to the well of Marvel Rivals for this week's discussion, because as some of you may know if you follow the news in the game space, there were some fairly high-profile layoffs that hit NetEase, specifically the Seattle-based development team working on Marvel Rivals. And yeah, we wanted to take some time and discuss those layoffs, because they're, obviously layoffs are always bad. But we also had some admittedly fairly conflicting feelings about some of the way that these layoffs themselves were actually reported within the game's media. So we thought it might be worth having a nuanced conversation about that to some degree.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a good starting point for some of this discussion is that, we'll get into specifics when we move forward, but there's been a lot of different headlines that I think kind of muddy the water in terms of what your immediate reaction to this news would be. So like Aaron said, the primary impacted team of the set of layoffs that we will be discussing was the team in Seattle. It comprised of, it looks like, mostly game designers. There was a there was a game director there as well that was let go, Thaddeus Sasser, who made some LinkedIn posts. He'll likely come up during our discussion. And then some other mid-level designers. And that was a team of roughly 6 people that was impacted. The main reason that I just bring that up early is because I feel like that information can become confusing based on some of the headlines that we might go through later. So those are the details as they have been provided to us by Forbes as of, I believe, like 7 or 8 days ago by Paul Tassi. So just to eliminate any confusion there, that is what has been appropriately reported by Forbes. Yes.
And also, as something of a disclaimer before we dig into some of the nuance surrounding this conversation, I hope for returning listeners that we have made it clear that we are not in any way the sort of people, take the show out of it entirely, but we're not the sort of people who would downplay layoffs, because any layoff, even just one, is a life-changing event for the person who has been laid off. Getting caught up in the tumult of the games industry is shocking. It can be traumatizing. It can derail an entire family's plans in an instant. It can halt somebody's career, and no number of layoffs is a good number of layoffs for people who are, just trying to make their way in a challenging industry. So regardless of what we discuss here over the course of the next, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, however long it takes us to get through it, we are always have been and always will be on the side of the developers. We are not here to downplay the significance of these layoffs, and we are not in any way, as some tweets surrounding the conversation about this may have indicated somewhat directly, we're not actuallying these layoffs at all. It does not matter to us that this was a support studio. It does not matter to us that it was a small team. We are not in any way, happy that, even just 6 people lost their livelihoods as a result of optimization at a company as big as NetEase. So, with that having been said, Zach, unless you had anything else to add to the disclaimer side of things, do you want to kind of walk us into?
I was just going to say real quick, I think you put that very well. But also, I think the important thing is to consider we're mostly going to be talking about and providing critique for the games journalism side and how things were reported. Yeah. This is not a lot of this conversation isn't going to be that focused on NetEase or like the developer end, because our critique is more of the people that reported on the event. Obviously, we don't like all of the things that Aaron just mentioned, but that's not so much the focus for today. So yeah, I would say outside of that, just to kind of break down the story a little bit more, we learned about this on February 18th. So that was roughly a little over a week ago. A bunch of people on LinkedIn started reporting that they had been let go from the Marvel Rivals team. And obviously we have a whole episode where we talk about Marvel Rivals and how much of a massive success it was. If people just need a quick reminder, though, Marvel Rivals made an estimated $136 million in revenue during the first month it was out, which I believe was in December. So we're talking about a big game that is doing very, very well. And they were still suffering from layoffs given their success. And so this really sparked this big narrative of, okay, I make a game, it fails, I have to suffer layoffs. I make a game and it becomes a critical success, I still suffer layoffs. And that's kind of where a lot of this story begins, is this idea that no matter what you do in games, someone's going to get laid off. At least that's kind of the mood that everybody is in right now.
And I would say justifiably. You can more or less look at any studio, any high profile studio that is likely to get reported on, and even the ones that don't get reported on just because of the nature of how contract work actually goes. It really does start to feel like a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, right? Where, again, a successful game results in layoffs and an unsuccessful game results in layoffs. So I guess everyone's just getting laid off. Congratulations to us. We've created a broken system. So that kind of became the narrative around these layoffs, again, justifiably. But what kind of stood out to Zach and I, independently of one another once the story started breaking, was that we realized just based on the headlines that we were reading, and I could go into a whole diatribe about the sort of responsibility paradigm that we as readers and writers, journalists as journalists, have when constructing headlines and when consuming headlines. But I will try to keep that off to the side, because obviously the story is in the story, not the headline, so we should be reading the whole story. But, the nature of doom scrolling and everything has led it to be that a lot of the time the headline needs to tell a fair amount of the story. Zach and I both came away from skimming headlines before digging into the story with the understanding that these layoffs were a lot further reaching than they ended up being.
Well, can you define, I think it's worth defining what we mean by further reaching as well here, because when we're talking about this section, I want to make sure everybody understands we are focusing purely on the number of people let go. And the reason we're doing that, actually, I'll speak for myself, Aaron, because I don't want to speak for you on this. From my perspective, especially with how kind of caustic and awful the games industry has been lately when it comes to layoffs, I think one of the worst things you can do is lay off a bunch of people, because that puts more people in competition. That's a big, larger quantity of jobs that become immediately more competitive. It just impacts more people. I think from a utility perspective, that is the most important thing to focus on. So that's what I will be focusing on here, is kind of this idea that these articles they produce this idea that a lot of people were laid off, a lot more than 6 people. And again, that is not to say that these 6 people did not matter and that this is not a horrific thing for these 6 people, but that is what we're using as a metric when we're having this comparative discussion. Sorry, Aaron, I just wanted to clarify that before.
No, that's an important, that,
for me.
That is 100% an important side note to have in there. That is more or less what I mean when I say far reaching. So to kind of illustrate that, we see a lot of headlines saying like entire US development team for Marvel Rivals laid off despite game's massive success, right? And while that is technically accurate, considering the only US-based developers working on Marvel Rivals actively at that time were at this Seattle-based studio, it does, through the power of language, paint the picture of NetEase looking at like a much larger team, or perhaps even multiple studios, perhaps, multiple satellite offices spread out across the United States, all of which were shuttered in order to, I don't know, optimize efficiency and whatever corporate jargon for this giant, offshore company. And looking at the reality of the situation, it is not that big, right? And again, to say any preventable tragedy isn't necessarily defined by the number of victims. Not to, equate, a layoff necessarily to, something particularly horrific or a natural disaster or anything like that. But they are useful metrics when determining the comparative weight of a bad situation. So yeah, we both independently, when we were discussing this, learned that we both thought there were a lot more people impacted by these layoffs that there ended up being. At first, numbers, I believe, were a little bit harder to come by in terms of exact facts and figures. And then the numbers started to come out, and it didn't really change the headlines all that much. So we kind of both had a confusing, internally confusing reaction to being more or less misled in some ways by the way that the story was being reported on.
Well, here's one thing I'm just thinking of that I don't. We've kind of touched around this in our personal discussions prepping for this, but part of it, I think, also has to do with the fact that when people are thinking of game studios, we've talked about this before on the show, game studios can range wildly in terms of how many people are on the team, but they're generally all smaller than you might think. For example, a big game studio is like 200, 300 people. Even 100 people is a big game studio, right? So when you're in those kind of, number of users, right, or developers rather, if you have 100 people and you lay off 6 people, that's 6%. Right? Normally, when we think about laying off 6% of a company, we might think of a big company like NetEase itself, which has, thousands and thousands of employees. I think it was 29,000 employees. Like 6% of 29,000 employees is a massive number of employees. So the reason I bring this up is because ultimately it's a semantics discussion, but when there are outlets reporting things basically saying, which one of these was it? The Gamer saying NetEase has laid off a bunch of Marvel Rivals devs. Well, what does a bunch mean? Like, yeah. Is a bunch 2? Is a bunch 6? Is a bunch 30? Like, the way that a lot of these articles try to convey information to normal consumers, I find to be not descriptive enough, just because, to me, candidly, just thinking of, like, if I heard Google lays off a bunch of employees and then the article was 6, I would feel like the article misled me. A bunch is a lot if you're a studio like Player First Games, which we'll get to, where you have like 50 employees and then a bunch is 6, because that's, what is that, like 12% of your company was laid off, if that's the case. So it's all relative. But this is all part of this conversation, is the language that you use in your title of your article does matter, because for better or worse, in this day and age, people will look at titles and they will develop opinions without reading your article.
Exactly. Which takes me back to that thing where I said, like, the headline responsibility paradigm, registered trademark, where it is our responsibility as informed consumers and people who want to do our due diligence and thorough research before forming an opinion on something to move past the headline and actually consume the written word to have a deeper understanding of the full story that goes beyond the headline, because a headline in most cases cannot tell the full story. But it is also the responsibility of journalists to understand that the overwhelming majority of people on the internet are going to see a headline, form an opinion, and move on. So the specific wording of these headlines, especially for something that does carry with it the weight of layoffs, especially in such a charged environment for those sorts of things, regarding, the games industry is very, it's drowning in layoffs right now. It's not a new topic for us. So there is a responsibility there to make sure that you are delivering the information in a clear, concise, direct, and not hyperbolic way. This is not a top 10 list. This is not an article about a hidden gem from 10 years ago that you dusted off on the shelf and decided to put in, and you wanted to write an article about it. But you don't want to name the game in the headline because it's more mysterious and it'll draw people in. You know what I mean? Those are very low stakes situations. This is accurately reporting on something that is part of a much larger conversation. And I think to some degree we run the risk when trying to make a case against the systemic organizational issues that lead to mass layoffs, that lead to unnecessary layoffs, even if they're not mass. We run into the risk of people using the wrong examples in conversations by saying, oh, well, the mass layoffs at NetEase. Does 6 people constitute a mass layoff? And even if the phrasing mass layoff was not used in any of these headlines, is that more or less what's being indicated? A sizable development team has been let go. The entire US division of Marvel Rivals has been let go. That is purposefully inflammatory language meant to draw people towards one conclusion. If that conclusion ends up being these layoffs are bad, then yes, great. Congratulations, you got people to click through. But it does not present the strongest case inside of the larger conversation. So there's just issues with being vague enough to indicate that it's a larger instance of layoffs than it actually is. And again, it's a small thing, but it does feel like an important semantic distinction.
Well, so let's take this, let's pull this back a layer, right? Why are we talking about this ultimately? The way that I described it to Aaron when we were initially talking about this topic and why I was kind of passionate about it was ultimately because I heard the story break. I had this perception in my mind that there was this massive amount of layoffs from Marvel Rivals. I got angry. I got frustrated. And then I learned that it was 6 people in Seattle that were laid off from the team. And again, this isn't to belittle their work. This is a massive impact for them. But I felt like I was lied to in that moment of reflection because I had spent all this energy. I had made all these opinions, and I felt like an idiot for believing it because that's how it was reported to me. And that's ultimately why we're having this discussion, is because I was made to feel dumb and everything's about me. No, but the reality here is, I think the story should be provocative enough on its own. I think it is provocative enough on its own. We have Marvel Rivals, which is by all metrics a critical success, laying people off. You can succeed and you will still face layoffs. That narrative stands true without you needing to add all this extra embezzling to make
embezzling?
It or not embezzling. What's the word?
Embellishment.
Embellishing. Sorry, I have dyslexia. I'm dumb. Embellishing. You were embezzling. Embellishing, right? Like, that's my point. I think that's ultimately our point, is we don't need to over exaggerate things here in order to make this a provocative, important story. Aaron, I think the one thing I would ask to further kind of illustrate your point, we've got a bunch of different article titles here on the NetEase layoffs. What do you think is an appropriate way to make a title for this versus an inappropriate way? I think that will help kind of convey where we're coming from with this discussion a little bit.
Yeah. I don't know. I think there's a fine line here. I actually don't think that it is in bad taste to mention the success of the game in the headline.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that.
I don't think that it is necessarily in poor taste to reference of course it's not in poor taste to reference like the geography of the team and where they were based, but GameIndustry.biz I think is a shining example of keeping it direct, right? Marvel Rivals US support studio hit with layoffs. Done. It's not the sexiest headline on the planet, but it avoids hyperbole almost completely.
Well, here's another one, right? So we saw some people complaining about the use of support studio because it belittled the work that those individuals put into the project. Okay, fair enough. What about Marvel Rivals layoffs baffle everyone after the game is a massive hit? That's a little bit less descriptive. That's from Forbes. That's from Paul Tassi. I read the article. It's incredibly well done. He has a great point of everybody loses here. There's no winners. It's all bad. But it doesn't suggest that the layoffs are massive. It doesn't really prescribe an amount to it. It just says there are layoffs, people are baffled, and the game was a massive hit. All these things are true. I don't think that that's, embellishing anything.
Right. On the flip side, I think there's a solid handful. Sportskita, or what a great name, hit, Marvel Rivals hits highest ever player count amid major layoffs. Fine with highest ever player. I'm fine with drawing the dichotomy. Major layoffs feels like it needs to be quantified to me because, again, each individual layoff was major to the person laid off, but to the NetEase, to the net number of people working on the game, is 6 people considered a major layoff, right? NetEase Games shocks gaming world. Entire Marvel Rivals Seattle team axed despite 20 million players with an exclamation point. That also seems hyperbolic to me. You've literally added the word shocks gaming world. Is that true? Were we shocked? Yeah. Is that, necessarily important flavor text for your headline in terms of keeping it descriptive? I don't know. I don't think maybe it is.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's like technically they did do a more like concise geo, right? Like they said Seattle, right? Like they didn't say, or precise, not concise. They did a more precise geo, rather than like Polygon saying NetEase Games lays off Marvel Rivals North America team, which is not very like emotional, but it's North America team. Again, people are going to read that and they might assume Marvel Rivals is a big game. Do they have studios in Canada? Do they have like, it's not descript enough. And so I think that suggests that it's potentially a wider reaching impact than it might actually be. And that's from a more reputable source than Sportskeeda, which obviously I don't think anyone's normally getting their news from that outlet. But ultimately, the point that Aaron and I are trying to make here before we kind of get to our next one, which involves another round of layoffs and how that was reported on, is that we feel like a lot of outlets were using kind of rage bait titles in order to drive, eyeballs to their articles, and that may have informed a portion of this conversation in a way that is, I don't know how destructive it really is ultimately. It's more of a thing of like, there are better examples that illustrate this game is successful by all metrics and people were laid off. The most famous one to me is Tango Games with Hi-Fi Rush, which I love, who got completely axed entirely. Whole studio closed by Microsoft
on the heels of a successful game.
Yeah, when their game was a massive success. They got a bunch of awards. And then Microsoft basically says, like, we want more award-winning games. And it's like, excuse me, you literally just cut one of your, like, best game studios in terms of, like, a studio that's actually made a game recently. And you're, like, claiming that you won all these awards. Anyway, that's kind of the point that we're trying to get to, is it feels very manipulative, the way that a lot of these titles were made.
Yeah. So to kind of to break down what Zach was alluding to here, I without wanting to come off as I understand how SEO works. I understand why SEO is important, and I understand that ultimately, considering this is still an important story, right? We do still want people to understand that these people were laid off despite this game's success. It is hard, though, without SEO, people aren't going to, see these things, right? But it is hard not to remember the sort of corporate money-making angle behind the payment structure for these websites when thinking about these headlines, right? So in essence, I have a suspicion that a lot of this is what I've been referring to as riding the SEO bullet train that is Marvel Rivals, right? So to pull back the curtain, Zach and I will, especially when formulating our titles for episodes and for sometimes deciding between two topics that we're like equally interested in, we will see which topics are drawing more general interest from people online, because ultimately we want more people to listen to the show. We want people to discover the show on whatever platform it is that they choose, and finding a topic and a title that will rank well through, Google's search terms and whatnot is in our best interest. And with possibly a couple of failures in there, we do try to keep our titling accurate to what we actually discuss in any given episode. But it is hard not to look at this situation and see there being a very clear SEO incentive to, front-loading Marvel Rivals and NetEase because they're probably both ranking pretty well in terms of search results, and also trying to drum up click-through and impressions by making these headlines a little bit more inflammatory than maybe they need to be. And the best counterpoint that I have come up with to illustrate this point is, again, if you follow the news in this space, which I'm assuming if you listen to this podcast, you probably do to some degree, Warner Brothers recently closed 3 studios right on the precipice of an earnings report, an investor meeting and whatnot. They axed Monolith Productions, best known for making the Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War Lord of the Rings games. They were currently somewhere in the middle of development hell on a Wonder Woman game, and that game project was canceled. The studio was closed, as was the studio Player First, which was behind Multiversus, the high-profile multiplayer live service flop starring Looney Tunes characters and Batman. And then Warner Brothers also axed Warner Bros. San Diego, another team working under their umbrella. So the number of layoffs, roughly, at Monolith, and this is just back of the napkin math based on LinkedIn searches, Monolith can account for somewhere in the neighborhood of 170 people listed on LinkedIn who may or may not be completely out of a job, may have been reallocated to a different studio, or may just be back on the job hunt. Player First is somewhere in the neighborhood of 70, and Warner Brothers San Diego is somewhere in the neighborhood of 40. So just with those numbers in mind, I'm going to run through a couple of headlines, just illustrating kind of what I'm talking about. From The Gamer, we have Warner Brothers cancels Wonder Woman game, shuts down Multiverses dev. All right. Engadget, we have Warner Brothers Discovery slashes gaming business, closes 3 studios. The Verge reports Warner Brothers Games is canceling its Wonder Woman game and shutting down 3 studios. Games Radar Plus reports open world Wonder Woman and Lord of the Rings studio shut down alongside Multiverses dev. Warner Bros. Insists it wants to focus on DC even as it kills a DC game. So we get a little bit more inflammatory there towards the end. Long title. Games Radar kind of does that, which I kind of appreciate. But yeah, all things considered, 2 things stand out to me about these headlines, especially when compared to those same publications and how they reported on Marvel Rivals. 1, they are, as a group, much more blunt. Very straightforward. The degree to which they are trying to use language to draw any sort of emotion from you is very minimal. These are utilitarian titles. The closest we get to that is the whole caveat of Warner Brothers insists it wants to focus on DC even as it kills a DC game. But I included that one predominantly because it brings my second point into focus, which is that all of these headlines for the Marvel Rivals layoffs either start with Marvel Rivals or NetEase. The Gamer reports NetEase has laid off a bunch of Marvel Rivals devs. It's got both keywords right in there. Engadget, Marvel Rivals team hit with layoffs. Okay, despite huge success of game. The Verge, Marvel Rivals US team is undergoing layoffs. Again, that's a utilitarian title, and I appreciate it, but again, just to illustrate what we're doing here, it is evident that Marvel Rivals is the SEO keyword that they are targeting in these titles. Warner Bros. Seems to be the sexiest they could come up with, but in at least, actually, hold on, in none of these examples that I have pulled, do they mention the name of the studios closed.
Or Shadow of War or Shadow of Mordor.
Mordor.
Yeah, they don't mention either of those games by name. Oh, how many of these even mention multiverses, which a few of them do.
Two of them do.
3 of them, actually. So, but here's the other thing, right? You keep talking about SEO, which I do think is important. I think that's part of the discussion. But for me personally, I think that we should really be talking about the clickbaitability and the rage baitability of these, because a lot of these are very neutered language when we're talking about these US studio closures, which are amounting to roughly 300 plus people being cut, 300 plus versus 6. And look, again, to mention my original point, I'm putting everyone on the same level here. I think ultimately quantity of people being laid off is the most important thing to look at here when we're talking about impact to the health of the industry. That is a massive amount of people. If you told me that Warner Bros. Has a major layoff, this is a major layoff. This is by every measure a major layoff. This is the kind of thing that I expected to read about when I saw an article that suggested there was, massive layoffs or significant layoffs or, a bunch of layoffs or something, right? Okay, actually, maybe a bunch is less than 300, but my point here is the articles from these different publications talking about Marvel Rivals are much more provocative and engaging than the neutered article names that we're getting for the Warner Brothers layoffs.
Exactly. And the reason that I kept harping on the SEO of all of this is because it does speak to me, at least, of a doubling down on, for lack of a less crass way of phrasing it, getting in while the getting's good, right? Warner Bros., I'm sorry to say this to both of you great brothers, is not sexy right now. The most recent Shadow of game came out in 2017. Wonder Woman has been languishing in development hell for years, and Multiversus is only really a headline generator because it shut down, and it was a spectacular flop after it relaunched. So it's kind of evident in the way that this is being reported on that there's not very many tools in the bag here to make this into a hugely sexy, provocative thing, unless you just want to focus on the number of layoffs, which they also aren't doing.
I mean, they're saying closing 3 studios, but which has a certain
weight to it naturally,
but I just look at these and it just bugs me from I just don't know why it's so neutered. If you're going to be mad about layoffs, be mad about layoffs consistently. They're both bad to the same level. I don't think Marvel Rivals... Okay, actually, I wouldn't say that. Sorry. Warner Brothers is worse. Warner Brothers is just a worse case of layoffs. 6 people in Seattle is just not... They are not equivalent. And I just don't understand.
Each individual layoff is as damaging and tragic as each other individual layoff, but taken as 2 separate incidents, 300 at a time is a more severe instance of mass layoff. It is a mass layoff. 6 is bad. Individually, each of them suck as much as any of the 300. But yeah, separated as 2 incidents, 300 is just demonstrably more impactful across the industry.
Yeah. And ultimately that's the point here is I'm trying to remember how I phrased it. Ultimately, if these articles about Marvel Rivals stoke the flame of, I'm going to be very dramatic, if these articles of Marvel Rivals layoffs stoke the flame of like revolution, and suddenly we get unions and suddenly we get all these protections for workers and da-di-da-di-da, well then great. Like there's ultimately, I'm not upset per se that all of this is going on, especially if it leads to positive change. The way I described it to Aaron is, especially if you're in the United States, there is so much negativity going on in the world. There's so much rage bait. There's so much news competing for our attention, demanding our attention, being bombastically thrown at us, that I just am extra frustrated by what looks to be rage bait material. And that's what this Marvel Rivals, a lot of the Marvel Rivals reporting appears to me as, especially because we have such neutered language about a significantly larger layoff from Warner Brothers. And that's ultimately just kind of my thought is like, if this leads to positive change, great. I haven't seen any significant change come from this Marvel Rivals reporting, from the reporting on this event. I've seen discourse online about how it doesn't matter if you're successful or not successful, you'll still face layoffs, but that's been happening forever. That has never not been the case. I think sometimes people look at the old games industry and they assume that it was like better, and in some ways I'm sure it was, but the reality is that people have been getting laid off after games have gone live for a long time. That is how it's worked. It's the same thing in like film and television. A lot of people get brought on for a project. When the project is done, they don't need as many people, so they lay people off. Aaron and I have friends who functionally have gone through this. Now, they were contract workers, so they don't get counted as a layoff. They just don't get renewed for their contract. But functionally, it's the same thing. And honestly, I mean, I have tons of issues with contract work. I don't know that we've done a full deep dive conversation into it. I can't remember, but like, it's no better. It's no better to me.
It's if anything, the facade of the contract work kind of just deadens the blow, and it prevents it from being a reportable event, right? So like, if I can guarantee you the number of people who left a job or left the job that they were employed at on the day that the game launched and came back to find out that their contract was not renewed, far outweighs any number of, significant layoffs across games, and you've never heard of it. You just don't hear about it because it's not really a reportable thing, right? These are employees who put their time into the game, and then once the game comes out and the support trails off, updates are less frequent, those people need to now look for another job. It's not a layoff because of the nature of contracts, and I'm not defending this, but it is, the reality of the industry. That's just not the sort of thing that gets reported on because it was essentially signed off on by the person who, needed the contract to continue working. And it's hard to find full-time salaried employment in games a lot of the time, unless it's a super senior role.
Yeah.
And even senior roles are contract sometimes.
Yep, contracts suck. You don't get benefits. You're sometimes literally considered less than in terms of like studio culture. You don't get the same kind of like social privileges and stuff like that. I hate the system. I am a massive hater.
It's a very bad system. But yeah, the reality of the situation is that's just how the industry works. Should it be? Absolutely not. And that's a whole other conversation to be had. There are systemic changes and organizational changes that can and should take place to prevent mass layoffs and the inequities of the contract system, but we're not seeing those changes happen. And to echo what Zach has said, if writing slightly hyperbolic, or in some cases of other articles that we didn't actually source from, even less reputable sources than Sportskeeda. Sorry, Sportskeeda. I'm sure you're trying your best. Then, if that were to be the rallying cry that sparked the great social change, right? Like one individual tragedy can be enough. We've seen this happen in other areas of social activism where one tragedy, one person impacted can be enough to embolden everybody else who's been impacted by these things to demand change, right? So it's not a matter of whether, you know, these 6 layoffs could be the catalyst to spark the big change. If that were to happen, fantastic. I celebrate it. I would be there on the front lines with you. Absolutely, I would. But that doesn't seem to be the case. And it just seems to be more of a situation where ad revenue profited and people got something to be angry about until the next thing to be angry about came along. And again, were it not for the fact that these two instances of layoffs at varying degrees of intensity happened so close to one another and were reported on so differently, this may not really have clicked with us as something to kind of try to dissect, but it's just bizarre. And it seems kind of self-serving and not necessarily, I won't say unethical, but it does seem somewhat suspect to me in terms of motivation.
Yeah, as two people that are constantly having conversations about what to title an episode and purposely trying to be as accurate as possible while also driving engagement, you know, we have conversations about this kind of stuff at least once every 2 weeks at minimum. And it's hard. We get that. It's easy to want to do clickbait. But like, is it appropriate, right? Like, are you servicing the reader? And I just don't think that that's happening. I think that a lot of these are technically correct. They are not lying to people with the way that they are phrasing things, but they are taking liberties to make it as provocative as possible in order to profit. They are not doing this, in my opinion, out of the kindness of their heart to try and establish this revolution for the workers and really pump up workers' sentiment. They're doing it to get more clicks. And that is my problem. And I just don't think it serves us that much at all. Like, that's the thing. Like, if it served us, then great. Like, be as provocative as you want. But I just don't think it does. And I think that it illustrates a lack of interest when these same outlets post this neutered language about a 300-person layoff. That's the main thing I want people to focus on with this episode. Why does Marvel Rivals get so provocative of article titles when we have such neutered language around a 300-person, 3-studio layoff? 3 established studios with storied history. I think Monolith had been a studio for 25 years.
Yeah.
25 years. Like,
I will say, in fairness, I'm pretty sure Player First was founded to make multiverses.
Player First is such a tragic situation. I mean, we're winding down here. I'm not going to, talk about this too much, but they were acquired by Warner Brothers after they had been working on multiverses for a while, and then they were just shuttered by Warner Brothers. So it's a situation. I haven't looked into it. Maybe that acquisition actually saved the studio, because there are a few cases where that's happened with studios getting bought before, but that's always tragic, because maybe they could exist in a different world where they weren't purchased.
Well, I don't know. I think there's a strong argument to be made that the relaunch with much more aggressive monetization definitely damaged the game and its reputation, which, for a live service game, you live and die by what people think and feel about your game. So I definitely think Warner Brothers had a hand to play in the downfall of that studio, to be sure. But yeah. I think, this may be our most cynical episode ever. And generally speaking, I tend to be on the side of games journalists, and I tend to, understand the challenges inherent in doing that job, especially in such like a weird environment for, discourse around. I mean, the games industry has always had its, toxicity in terms of conversation, but, now it's a little bit a little bit crazy. So I tend to, be understanding of that sort of thing. But yeah, there's just such an incredible discrepancy between these things that I can't help but, put on my weird conspiratorial hat and start following the money, and just, it leads me to the conclusion that, again, I don't think we're looking at these headlines trying to serve the search for justice for these 6 people who were sadly, taken away from their jobs and put back on the market, despite the success of the game that they were working on. I'm sure that the people writing the articles genuinely do care about these layoffs, but I also think that they were either internally or externally motivated to get eyes on that story, because people will follow Marvel Rivals right now. It's just that hot.
Yeah,
and to some degree, I can't even necessarily exempt us from that, because I don't think we're probably not hitting an SEO goldmine with this episode even a little bit. Because this story has, the Monolith stuff is much more fresh than the Rivals stuff. No. But the first time we talked about Marvel Rivals, we absolutely did that, in part because Marvel Rivals was a huge ranking SEO goldmine. We wanted to be able to ride the success of Marvel Rivals to maybe a couple of new eyeballs on a YouTube video or ear holes on a podcast episode. So it's not that we're exempt from that process, but it does feel slightly disingenuous to do it the way that it's been done here. I guess that's my thought.
I was just going to end on the note that if anyone, I don't think anyone would do this. One, I don't think our audience is big enough, and I don't think that it's full of people that would do this. But don't harass journalists that have made,
God, no,
bombastic article titles. The thing is that there's so many things that probably go into making that title. That individual may not even be the one responsible for the title. It's very possible that they were told, make this more provocative, make this more click-worthy. I want more eyeballs, whatever it is, right? The person's just trying to do their job, just trying to make money. Even if they are being malicious, we don't know. There's too many factors. Don't harass anybody. It's not worth it in this bad situation. In general, like no one benefits from that.
A couple of notes just on that point before we sign off. One, first off, I'm implying no malicious intent on the part of the authors. I'm genuinely not. And even if there was, this is not even the greatest evil committed in the last 20 minutes, considering the state of the world right now. So if you're going to try and find something to be angry about and really put your energy into it, make it something worthwhile. Don't make it harassing a games journalist. And on that note as well, I have in the past had my articles retitled out from under me, right? I have written articles that were published that then my editor decided to sex up in a way that I did not appreciate, but in a way that served their SEO focus better, right? It didn't happen to me very often, but it has happened to me, where an article I wrote, slightly more descriptive title became a little bit more clickable as opposed to descriptive. So that sort of thing definitely does happen. So yeah, no, to Zach's point, just don't. Just if you take anything from this, it's to keep your head on a swivel, and question motivation rather than taking everything at face value. But don't be an asshole.
Really, the main takeaway before we get into the thank yous is you should read the entirety of an article.
Yeah, just read the article.
Yeah.
That helps. Honestly, if you want, you know what? Good point, Zach. Candidly, if you want less clickbait on the internet, start reading the whole article. If it's a topic that interests you, start reading the whole article. And you'll get less clickbait in general. That is how you move that needle. If you can prove to people that they will get click through on non-clickbait articles, then you'll start to see less clickbait if everyone did that in mass. Our audience is not big enough to affect that level of social change, but be the small scale change you want to see. And also you'll get all the information instead of allowing headlines to, sway you in one direction through provocative language.
Also, just read more than one article.
Yes, please read more than one article.
You should probably follow like the triangulate, like in science, a lot of time, and even math, you triangulate to like find the right point. Like, yeah, maybe you should read 3 articles and see which one seems more reasonable about what the reality is. But anyway, all of that being said, I'm good to move on to our please and thank yous. Well, not really so much please, but.
Well, no, I have a please. Please listen to Beach Girl. Please listen to Beach Girl. I often on these episodes thank Beach Girl for providing our wonderful intro and outro music, as well as a robust library of tunes that can be found anywhere fine digital music is hosted on the web. And you'll be thanking us and yourself for taking the time and listening to Beach Girl. So please do that. And thank you, Beach Girl. Please and thank you.
And I would like to ask everybody to please check out eDougie Art or Mosscat Market. They're the same person with 2 different names. I actually need to check to make sure that the Etsy hasn't been updated to Mosscat Market. So anyway, regardless, that is our wonderful friend and artist that, of course, made our album art, our cover art for our show, our logo, all of that jazz. Please make sure to check them out on Etsy and on Instagram. Instagram, it is definitely at Mosscat Market. On Etsy, it's either at Mosscat Market or at eDougie Art.
Etsy is also Mosscat Market now.
Oh, they're both Mosscat Market now. Well, thank God. I no longer have to say eDougie Art. eDougie Art is dead to me now.
No, we loved eDougie Art. Long live eDougie Art and Mosscat Market. But now live longer, Mosscat Market. Live Moss. That's their slogan.
And with that, I will bid you all adieu. Thanks for watching. Listening.
Goodbye! Yeah, just read the article.